Wait another second or two. Because I did want to talk briefly about the response assignment that's due on Monday. Everything's coming up so quickly. Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to, good, people are coming in. I'm going to just do a screen share a minute. And, okay, here's E-class. I don't think I have discussed with you, have I yet, the assignment, and I thought I should do that this morning a minute. My computer, honestly, there we go. Okay, I don't know if you've all had a chance to look at this yet. I expect most of you have, because my submission date is for next Monday, and the submission portal is included here in week 5 of E-class along with these guidelines. I just wanted to run through this a minute because I have not given you specific passages as topics, but asked you to select your own topic. So what I'm asking you to do in this short exercise of a mere 3 pages, 12-point font, double spaced, in proper essay format, that is with an introduction and a middle and a conclusion and an identifiable thesis statement that articulates an opinion that is arguable, by which I mean your thesis statement takes up a position in relation to the text and then indicates in some way what kind of conclusion you'll arrive at. You know all of this, but I just wanted to remind you that I am looking for a formally organized and argued mini essay, I guess. This is not a research assignment, so you do not need to undertake additional research, although you are always encouraged to do that, to look up 1 or 2 essays that on the text that you choose to deal with that might help you think your way through it. But I'm just going to run through this a minute and see if you have any questions, okay? And then what I'm going to do today is ask us to get together and to perform a kind of proto-response paper in relation to maybe 3 passages that we'll have a chance to look at today, any of which you may take up in your response paper. So this short response paper asks you to carry out a close reading in proper essay format of a passage from one of the texts we've read since class began. So I expect most of you will be writing on Villette. That you believe, a passage that you believe is central to the text from which it comes. For example, this is just for example, to its themes, that is to the main ideas of the text, perhaps to the question of what it means to be alone or to be a narrator and so on, to its plot or plots, to its development of character or characters, to its structure and language, to its political commitments, to its immersion in a particular historical moment, etc., etc., etc. Just deal with a passage that interests you and unpack that passage. Read it between the lines. You might even choose to focus on 1 or 2 words in a passage and their usage. Your passage could be anything from a chapter in length to a paragraph in length, or even just a part of a paragraph. Choosing a longer passage does not necessarily mean that you're undertaking a more difficult assignment. Anyways, we'll talk about that in just a moment. So I want you to do a close reading of a passage that intrigues, confuses, aggravates, annoys perhaps, or excites you, and that can be ultimately demonstrated to be important to the text as a whole. So your close reading will demonstrate, will indicate a knowledge of the text as a whole from which it comes. That is, that you will be able to indicate to me that you're familiar with the text as a whole. So if you look at a particular passage that says something important, for example, about Lucy Snow's development, that is about the evolution of her persona or her character, you'll want to be able to say something about how this passage ties into that development as a whole, if you see what I'm saying. We'll do some work on this today here in class, and I can certainly take any questions further. By close reading, I mean giving careful attention to the language of the passage. For example, once again, not necessarily, but for example, its rhetorical techniques, it's the language of persuasion that it employs, its use of perhaps dialect, conversation, its capacity to surprise or delight, and so on. So you can see this is a very open-ended assignment, and to its position in the text as a whole. So the question you're answering in this close reading, and I've given you, I think, 2 documents in week 5 that specifically address what a close reading looks like. Have a look at those 2 very brief documents. Why is this passage significant to the text? And then go on to elaborate a supportive argument for your informed opinion. And I give you a couple of hints about how to set up the passage. I don't want you to quote the entire passage at the beginning of your paper, but to be a little bit more subtle in the technique you use to introduce the passage. Indicate, for example, where it takes place in the text. And I've given you a couple of examples here from Bronte's novel. For example, in chapter, what is that? Chapter 19 of Charlotte Bronte's Villette. So there I know where the passage is right away. I know that you're dealing with this novel by this author. So in chapter 19 of Charlotte Bronte's Villette, ironically entitled The Cleopatra, we're going to look at this passage today. Lucy Snow shares in Monsieur Paul's excoriation of 4 paintings of the life of a woman as being flat, dead, pale, and formal. So I even quote the passage in my introduction of it. This would be my first sentence and my first paragraph, and then I'll refine this by the end of that first paragraph into a thesis, the articulation of opinion. Suggesting that aesthetic judgment is central to the novel's conception of the fully developed self. See how I did that? See how I introduced the passage? I set it up as the topic of my close reading. Another example, in this brief response, I consider the importance of the early English novel to what Charles Taylor calls the emergence of a new consciousness in the 17th chapter of Sources of the Self, if you decided to take up Charles Taylor in your close reading. So these are just examples of how to set up your passage, how to position it within the text as a whole as the one that you're going to be dealing with, okay? And again, your response to this particular passage should demonstrate familiarity with the text as a whole. Don't ask me to select a passage for you, but do feel free to email me at any point between now and next Monday. If you and even feed me a thesis statement, let me know what you're planning to work on and ask for my feedback, and I'll be happy to get back to you on that. Okay. What was I going to say? Are there any questions about this assignment and my expectations for it? Are we good to go with that? Like I said, do feel free to be in touch. I will have my office hours again on Friday, of course, for you to drop in and talk to me about the assignment. And just one final reminder, if you do find yourself in need of an extension of a few days, hopefully at max, just let me know that you want a little bit of extra time. Make up some excuse, however lame, for why you need to submit late, and I will accept it, no questions asked. When I say by an excuse, most of you will say, look, I have 4 assignments due on the same day, and I haven't been sleeping well, and I just really need, that's fine. Or, if you get COVID or some other catastrophe, I don't need to know details of any of that. Just make something up and let me know, and then also let me know when you think you can submit by, so that I can anticipate when to receive it. Once again, please submit as a Word document, not as a PDF or some other format. If you do end up submitting after the assignment portal closes next Monday at 5 or 9 or whenever it was I said in there, you'll need to submit as a Word document in an attachment to an email. And you will be, I will be returning your assignment, your graded assignments to you in individual emails as attachments, as marked up attachments. So any questions about that at all right now? No, you're all confident, ready to go. Why don't we undertake just such a close reading this morning so that we all feel confident about being on the same page. I was going to do some other, I have some notes I'm going to share with you just momentarily for where I want to go today and on a Wednesday. Hope I can get this to work. Here we go. Can everyone see that large enough? A brief reminder of where I think we left off last Wednesday, and then I'm going to jump ahead to this down here, okay? And look at these three passages, and these are passages that you're all welcome to take up again in your close reading assignment if you haven't already selected a passage, and if you're flailing a little bit, and to make use of whatever conversation we have today in your close reading assignment, I'm happy with that. So do feel free to do that. But before I get down there, I just want to remind you of where we left off last Wednesday. And then I'm going to stop talking for a bit and I'm going to listen to what you guys have to say after I do a reading. We determined, or I determined last Wednesday, that Lucy is a contradictory character, that she's driven by a certain kind of fundamental tension between the desire for withdrawal and privacy and silence on the one hand, and a moral, indeed a Christian compunction to act positively in the world on the other. So the tension is between inner and outer, between private self and public self, between a kind of authenticity, who the real Lucy is, and the need to perform in the public sphere in ways that may not be true to herself. Everyone see what I'm saying here? And that this particular tension is one with which we all exist. That is, we all perform different versions of ourselves, performances that are required by the environment or the context in which we find ourselves. And I've even suggested that what I'm doing right now, of course, is a kind of performance, a pedagogical performance that may be something that I would, under normal circumstances, be very hesitant to do. Okay, so we might say that this, the tension that is at the heart of Lucy's existence is between authenticity, the true self, whatever that is, and the self that she projects in order to get by in the world. I want to make one final suggestion, and that is that Lucy's reiterated assertion to us as readers that she would prefer to remain in the background, and her kind of latent masochism, and we're going to look at a scene right away in which I think is nothing other than masochistic. She kind of imprisons herself at various points in the novel, might be a predicament that only a female narrator needs to suffer. It's hard to imagine a male narrator constantly declaring his desire to withdraw from the world. Maybe Lucy's need to be invisible, the sort of background observer, says something important to us about her daring to take up the pen and become an author, the author of her own story, that there are risks involved in that. accusations of being too public. It's not appropriate to a woman. So in other words, Lucy, lover or hater, I think what makes Lucy quite a remarkable first-person narrator is precisely her need to negotiate certain kinds of restrictions that a male novelist would not need to negotiate in the mid-19th century. And that the novel, in fact, can maybe even be read as a kind of feminist or proto-feminist exploration of what is or is not possible for a young orphaned girl who must make her way in the world. And she decides to do that by teaching, right? Which is a kind of performance. Okay. I'm going to leave that for now. That's just a segue into these passages I want to look at. And I'll put these bullet notes up on eClass because they have the page numbers and the chapter numbers. I want to look at these passages today. I want to read this first passage. I told you we'd get to this, and I know you're all eager to talk about it. The play within the novel. I called the play within the novel because the play seems to, there's a kind of performance going on here. It's a very unusual moment in the novel where Lucy claims to discover something about herself, okay? And she's very uncomfortable with it. It's an uncomfortable passage. It not only reveals Lucy's own discomfort with the fact that she has to act a certain role, and of all roles, she has to act the role of the fop. If you don't know what a fop is, highlight that word as one that you might want to investigate in a close reading. And if you don't know what a coquette is, that's another word that you might highlight and have a look at. I'm not going to tell you what those words mean if you don't know what they are, but the flirt and the foppish young man. Okay, the passage I want to look at is in chapter 14, pages 209 to 210. I hope you all have your texts with you and a pen beside you or a pencil to do some markup. I'm going to read this entire passage without pause. And then I'm going to throw out to you, if I asked you to do a close reading of this passage, because I think it's important in some way, what way do you think that is? And what kind of language is being used here? And what is Lucy telling us about herself? What's going on in this passage? That's all I want to do. So I'm going to stop my share now. And I'm going to read this passage, and then let's have a conversation about it. You're welcome to use your little hand gesture or just unmute yourself. We'll see where we take this, okay? I'm going to start right at the top of page 209. This is the paragraph, for those of you who might have a different edition, that begins, "He vanished. The curtain drew up." That first speech was the difficulty. So this is Lucy recollecting her sudden, Monsieur Paul forces her to act in this vaudeville, in this bit of light theater, because the other actor is unable to do it. Okay, that first speech was the difficulty. It revealed to me this fact, that it was not the crowd I feared so much as my own voice. Foreigners and strangers, the crowd were nothing to me, nor did I think of them. When my tongue once got free and my voice took its true pitch and found its natural tone, I thought of nothing but the personage I represented, and of Monsieur Paul, who was listening, watching, prompting in the side scenes. By and by, feeling the right power come, the spring-demanded gush and rise inwardly, I became sufficiently composed to notice my fellow actors. Some of them played very well, especially Ginevra Fanshawe, who had to coquette, between two suitors and managed admirably. In fact, she was in her element. I observed that she once or twice threw a certain marked fondness and pointed partiality into her manner towards me, the fop. With such emphasis and animation did she favor me, such glances did she dart out into the listening and applauding crowd, that to me, who knew her, it presently became evident she was acting at someone. And I followed her eye, her smile, her gesture, and ere long discovered that she had at least singled out a handsome and distinguished aim for her shafts, full in the path of those arrows taller than other spectators and therefore more sure to receive them, stood in attitude quiet but intent, a well-known form, that of Dr. John. The spectacle seemed somehow suggestive. There was language in Dr. John's look, though I cannot tell what he said. It animated me. I drew out of it a history. I put my idea into the part I performed. I threw it into my wooing of Ginevra. In the hours, or sincere lover, I saw Dr. John. Did I pity him as I erst? No, I hardened my heart, rivaled and outrivaled him. I knew myself but a fop, but where he was outcast, I could please. Now, I know I acted as if wishful and resolute to win and conquer. Ginevra seconded me. Between us, we half changed the nature of the role, gilding it from top to toe. Between the acts, M. Paul told us he knew not what possessed us, and half expostulated, "C'est peut-être plus beau que votre modèle," said he, "mais ce n'est pas juste." I know not what possessed me either, but somehow my longing was to eclipse that ours, i.e. Dr. John. Ginevra was tender. How could I be otherwise than chivalric? Retaining the letter, I recklessly altered the spirit of the role. Without heart, without interest, I could not play it at all. It must be played. In went the yearned for seasoning. Thus flavored, I played it with relish. What I felt that night and what I did, I no more expected to feel and do than to be lifted in a trance to the seventh heaven. Cold, reluctant, apprehensive, I had accepted a part to please another. Ere long, warming, becoming interested, taking courage, I acted to please myself. Yet the next day, when I thought it over, I quite disapproved of these amateur performances. And though glad that I had obliged M. Paul and tried my own strength for once, I took a firm resolution never to be drawn into a similar affair. A keen relish for dramatic expression had revealed itself as part of my nature. To cherish and exercise this newfound faculty might gift me with a world of delight, but it would not do for a mere looker on at life. The strength and longing must be put by, and I put them by, and fastened them in with the lock of a resolution which neither time nor temptation has since picked. No sooner was the play well and over than the choleric and arbitrary M. Paul underwent a metamorphosis. An hour of managerial responsibility passed. He had once laid aside his magisterial austerity. In a moment, he stood amongst us, vivacious, kind, and social, shook hands with us all round, thanked us separately, and announced his determination that each of us should in turn be his partner in the coming ball. On his claiming my promise, I told him I did not dance. For once I must, was the answer, and if I had not slipped aside and kept out of his way, he would have compelled me to this second performance. But I had acted enough for one evening. It was time I retired into myself and my ordinary life. My dun-colored dress did well enough under a paletot on the stage, but would not suit a waltz or a quadrille. Withdrawing to a quiet nook, whence unobserved I could observe the ball, its splendors and its pleasures passed before me as a spectacle. That's the passage I might choose to do a close reading of if I were to do the assignment that I've asked you to do. What's going on in this passage? Is there anything that strikes you about it at all? You can jump in here from any angle, make any observations on the language used, on the way that Lucy describes herself. There are certain words that are repeated in maybe some interesting ways. Yeah, Daniel.
Well, might be a rather basic understanding of it, but this is a notion of Lucy where she's not a person in the wings or being a wallflower, for lack of a better term. She's actively up on a stage where people are paying attention to her. And which is completely, again, I believe she was coerced into doing this by Monsieur Paul, effectively. So this wasn't something she would have done, but she's still, nonetheless, there's a level of enjoyment she gets from being within the spotlight of this. But correct me if I'm wrong, after this passage, she decides to never act again, correct?
Yes, well, in fact, in this very passage, she claims to have never indulged in this sort of acting again. Neither nor temptation lured her into it.
Yeah, which I don't know why. It, for some reason, it, like, just reading it when you were reading it, for some reason I got a weird Puritan vibe from it, of this. I might be connecting dots that may not necessarily string up, but this idea of the temptation and then immediately avoiding it, and well, despite the fact she's enjoying something, she recognizes this and immediately cuts it out of her life. And I don't know why. For some reason, this air of like Puritanism, or whatever the correct term would be, from, and that it's just something that I noticed right there.
It's interesting that you describe her as puritanical. So she's drawn out, but this is a singular instance, because she does this once and never again. And I'll leave it at that. So there was nothing simplistic, by the way, about anything you just said there. But those are embryonic observations, and we want to take them a bit further, right? So there's this internal struggle on her part between her puritanical tendencies, and we use the word puritanical these days in a slightly, I think, negative way, which is perhaps correct. But she seems to discover something about herself that makes her uncomfortable. Yes, she is coerced into this moment on the stage, and of course, there's a huge irony in the fact that she plays a fop, a light-headed, morally suspect, and kind of inconsequential character, right? A bit of a clown figure. Okay, so this is good. Thank you. I see other hands up. I'm just going to take them as they appear. Cheyenne, and then Emily.
So something that kind of just, like, thinking about it, is that so like you said, the one time that she's kind of in the public eye and being perceived by so many others is not even really as herself, it's as this character. So I mean, it is her doing it, but realistically she still kind of gets the protection of like a costume, and she's still not herself. And a fop is a man, right? So she's still being now perceived as a man, not even a woman. Also, right, I think prior to this scene, she goes through the little dilemma of which costume to use, because Ginevra wants to dress her up in this costume. I think that's who it was, as a man. And she's hesitant and reluctant, and she doesn't do it her way. She wants to do it her own way. So she goes into the dressing room and fixes herself as she'd like, which I just think is like, I don't know, the internal process of putting on a different persona kind of in her own way. I don't know, that's what struck me about that.
Well, she's literally, and thank you for pointing this out, she's literally cross-dressing here. It's a cross-dressing scene. And she's playing a male role. So that's part of what makes this a remarkable scene, is that she not only steps outside of herself to do something to which she is, by, as she says, by nature, and in fact, she talks about being true to herself and being natural in this passage, and everything that she is forced to do is unnatural, and yet she identifies a part of her nature as she's up there on stage. She takes pleasure, right? And it's a kind of visceral pleasure. It's almost a sexual pleasure, because there's a bit of a sexual dalliance going on, that Ginevra and she are literally in the archaic use of this term, making love to each other on the stage, right? They're making eyes at each other. There's flirtation going on. She's forced into a position that she, from the very outset of the text, has resisted adamantly, and she takes pleasure in it. Okay, so I'll leave my comments at that. Thanks for that, Cheyenne. Emily.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention that I found it kind of interesting that Genevra, it was easy to play the role that she was in, which I feel like is she's always acting within that role, versus like Lucy, she needed the courage to kind of basically perform this, which is like a performance of the self, where like Genevra, she is already knows herself, and kind of Lucy's kind of just experiencing this and realizing that like she can do things like this, like she can step outside of herself to do crazy things like act.
Yes, I mean, Lucy observes of Ginevra that she is in her element. Maybe we want to unpack that phrase a little bit and think about what that means. And there's some other language that I find possibly that I think we can draw out this language without fear of exaggerating. Okay, because there's something sensual, if not sexual, going on in this passage. I think the passage intimates that Lucy is discovering, to her horror, something about her sexual self, if I may say that. That first sentence of the third paragraph in the passage I read, the spectacle seemed somehow suggestive. Suggestive of what? When we use that word, we typically talk about it in sensual terms, right? That one act is suggesting something else. So what about that language? And what about the moment in which I acted to please myself, she said. And then there's this immediate desire to withdraw from that. Okay, I see a bunch of hands here because I know you all have lots, and I'm just going to go from left to right again, and I'll get to all of you. Abigail.
I definitely see the masochism of this, of how she said, cold, reluctant, apprehensive, I had accepted a part to please another. Ere long, warming, becoming interested, taking courage, I acted to please myself. And then later she says, but I had acted enough for one evening, and it was time I retired into myself and my ordinary life. Like, she just doesn't allow herself to have fun. Like, she doesn't allow her, she just thinks that because she was orphaned and has had this horrible lot in life, and it's just, she's not deserving of good things. Is like, that's really how I've read Lucy's character, is like, she's judgy, but she's judgy because that's the only thing she knows. Yeah, I don't know. She very much masochistic, very much like, I'm not allowed to enjoy these things, so I'm not going to.
Now, masochism, and I do want to look at one more passage today in which I think her masochistic tendencies are explicitly addressed. Masochism, of course, is can take many different forms, but there's a certain kind of pleasure in masochism, right? That is a pleasure in self-flagellation, whether that's emotional self-flagellation or a literal self-flagellation. So this is a scene in which she has to actively repress herself, and she has to repress herself because she's enjoying it too much. Exactly what she's enjoying is hinted at in this passage, and I think we can draw that out. But I think it's more than simply the fact that she finds herself in front of an appreciative audience, which most of us would take some pleasure in. But it's also, there's something about her sexual nature that seems to wake up on the stage, and that also scares her. Now, I've mentioned that a couple of times, and I should stop, and I'll let you do a little bit more work on that. Laura.
So sorry, I dropped my pen. So I myself am queer. That's the term I use to identify myself, and I found myself relating to this passage and the ideas about sexuality and gender that kind of arise as part of it, the way that Lucy throws herself into this role, which, like, she's cross-dressing, she's flirting with another woman, even as performance, and she's enjoying it on such a visceral level. But then when it ends, she shuts it down and she says, I'm never doing this again. I have never done this again. I will never do this again. And just there's a very I feel like that's such a that's a part of the a part of that could be interpreted it as something very much like the queer experience for trans folk, gay folk. Yeah, I found it really fascinating, and that was what came to mind for me first when I was reading this passage.
Well, thank you for that, Laura. And I think you're quite right. I think there's and I'm always hesitant to speculate about authorial intention. Okay, but that said, I'm going to just put that aside for a moment. This does seem to be a passage in which queer desire is explored in an interesting way. And whether or not Bronte had any intention of doing that is irrelevant to the fact that most of us, are able to extract from this very curious moment in the text, at least a kind of frightening and unanticipated identification of not only desire for public acclamation, but also a different kind of desire, something that's a bit deeper there. And there is a word that I do want to turn to in just a minute. I'm going to take Artemis' thoughts first, but that word, the word spectacle, which is repeated on at least 2 occasions in this passage, including the very last word. She makes a spectacle of herself. Didn't our mothers and fathers say, stop making such a spectacle of yourself? You're embarrassing yourself. Don't behave like that in public. She's made a spectacle of herself here, and she's the one who usually sits back and watches the world go by as if it's a spectacle. But for the moment, she becomes part of the spectacle, right? Think about what a spectacle is. Something that is all about seen and being seen, right? A visual performance of some sort. Okay, very interesting. Artemi.
Well, excellent, awesome points here by everyone. I'm not even sure what to add. I guess what I wanted to talk about in terms of this was, like, especially when it comes to that third paragraph, like the spectacle seems somehow suggestive, like that idea of her getting intimate with not only like her character that she's portraying, but like even with like her fellow actors and kind of Dr. John. And it's very interesting because you can tell that she is taking pleasure in it and she feels like she's not supposed to. Like it's and that's sort of why she, you know, at the end when it's all over and she's kind of out of the trance, she's like, oh, I will never do this again. It almost like she felt like dirty or something, you know. And I thought, yeah, like it's interesting how she gets lost in the character and in the performance, but then realizes that it's an exaggerated version of like her society, and because she's been kind of hiding this entire time, when she kind of gets back to herself out of the character, she realizes that, oh, like this is not good. It won't be good for me or for others. Yeah, I just thought that was kind of neat. I guess I'm sort of repeating what everybody said.
That's okay. Through repetition comes knowledge. Because I also want to repeat myself on a couple of points. The word spectacle appears twice. So does the word relish, which is another really interesting word. One relishes food. one relishes sensual experience, right? And so thus flavored, I played the role with relish, she said at the end, and then a keen relish for dramatic expression had revealed itself as part of my nature. So it's not only a cross-dressing scene, but it's kind of in some ways an undressing scene, an undressing of one's protections, right? And she discovers something about herself that scares her or appalls her or disgusts her. And then so she repeats once again, this would not do for a mere looker on at life. And then the final sentence, withdrawing to a quiet nook whence unobserved I could observe the ball, its splendors and its pleasures passed before me as a spectacle. Okay, okay, great. Thank you. Cheyenne.
Okay, so just following all our discussion on spectacle and observing and everything else. Okay, I'm saying this with a very, very light connotation, like it's just kind of popped in my head and I was like, what if that's what she's thinking? Again, very light connotation. But what came to mind was like voyeurism, like that she is being watched and then that's when all these feelings come, which is kind of like, yeah. Or then like the other thing is that she's doing it in front of Dr. John, and her and Guinevere are talking in front of him. And that normally when she talks to him or talks to anybody, Guinevere or Dr. John, it's in private. And so back to the whole like in private versus in public thing. Yeah, so that's what came to my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So it just, if I might develop what I think it is you're saying, that well, maybe this isn't what you're saying at all. She surprises herself in this passage. She's surprised to find herself taking pleasure in what she consistently throughout the novel, and this goes back to the earlier comments on her masochism, attempts to hide or to repress. It is a scene of profound, the ultimate triumph of her urge to self-extinction, right? There's one other word in the passage that I think we need to that we can look at in our close reading and make much of, is when she comes down off the stage, she says, Mr. Paul had undergone a metamorphosis, some kind of fundamental transformation of who he was. While she was on stage, he was yelling from the sidelines, right? But as soon as she comes off stage, he's nothing but pleasure and delight in his performers. And so is Mr. Paul's metamorphosis, in fact, also her metamorphosis? She undergoes a metamorphosis here, but then she calls back into her shell, right? So it's a momentary metamorphosis that she ultimately rejects. Daniel.
Okay, so just all these conversations necessarily revolving around theater. I find it very interesting because we talk about this, like, be it levels of voyeurism or be it, the queer coded nature of this possible scene. I, however, was like, and I think I realized why I used the term Puritan earlier is because I possibly was looking at it from a borderline religious, like, flagellation standpoint because it's even mentioned in the text, this semi-anti-Catholic narrative at times.
More than semi.
Yeah. Yes, and that could be like relegated to aspects of being English and the Protestant nature of that, but which is interesting. But the way that I'm noticing, the way we could talk about, be it like interactions with religion, be it queer coding or voyeurism, it all relates to this sense, and it's been mentioned in the chat several times. The nature of theater exposing, and I can relate to somebody who's been in theater productions, the actual nature of theater in itself exposing you to aspects of yourself and characters and characteristics that you don't think about or don't want to think about. I can experience as myself who's played characters before where I've played characters who I'm thinking, wow, I am nothing like this actual character. And then at the end of the scene and finishing it, go, wow, okay, that hits close to home. And
Yeah. So
well, and I think that's where the possible, like, necessarily the fear, like why she refuses never to go back to theaters, because of this nature of it makes her confront aspects of her that she likes to keep closed. She's an emotional shut-in. Theater, you can't do that. You physically cannot do that on stage. And I think that's something that is certainly interesting to notice at that point.
yes, so the theatricality of the entire scene is, of course, central to it, I think. And I appreciate what you say about, well, I think what you're talking about in part is method acting, right? And also having to inhabit what she calls a personage, what we would call a persona, that is a performed self that is not the authentic self. It's a disguise that she's taking on here, right? She's wearing a certain mask. Okay, that very good. Abigail, I want to hear what you say, and then I want to look, just because we're almost out of time, very briefly at one other passage. And I'm not even going to look at the passage, I'm going to ask you to look at it. But yes, Abigail.
I'm very quick. Cheyenne, I think you said that it was voyeuristic. Yeah. I fully agree with you. That was also the first term that popped into my head, is that, she's not really used to people watching her despite her being a teacher. And I mean, I think that you can't really conflate the two. These are two very different things. But I think back to like the first couple chapters when she was still at her godmother's house, and she was more of like a specter than anything else. And like really just sort of didn't get interacted with at all. And I think that that's really, she's carried that through with within the narrative. But I completely agree with you, Daniel. She's an emotional recluse, and working in theater, and things get very real very quickly in these imagined scenarios. And I think, and I have a very extensive background in theater. I was never an actor, despite all of this, all that. But I've definitely watched actors come off of the stage and being like, ooh, that's never affected me like that before, and now it has, and now I don't know what to do about it. But I've definitely seen people from like the beginning of rehearsals to the end of a production be like completely changed. So I think that inhabiting the character changed her in ways that she recognized and was terrified of.
Well,
so then she never did it again.
And the question opened up by your comments on voyeurism is who are the voyeurs? And I think maybe we, the readers, are that we are privileged to witness this moment of self-revelation in the novel, and then to know that Lucy flees this scene. We have to read this scene in light of other moments in the novel, I think, where Lucy is confronted with art and has a very peculiar reaction to it. So we're out of time, so I'm just going to mention that the scene on page 328, when she goes back to the theater to watch this world famous actress Vashti act, she's horrified. She's horrified once again, and she concludes her comments on, her haughty brow, those the two shortest sentences in the novel, page 328. It was a marvelous sight, a marvelous revelation. It was a spectacle, low, horrible, immoral. When we reconvene on Wednesday, maybe we'll look at that scene, but I also want to look at the scene in which she goes to the gallery and looks at the 4 paintings that constitute a kind of narrative story about the life of a woman, it's called, and she finds the paintings just despicable. So her reaction to art is really interesting and may have something to say to help us enrich our reading of the passage that we just looked at. Anyways, we're out of time. Thank you all for that. That was really useful for me too, to see the passage through your eyes. I will do at least one or two other exercises in close reading on Wednesday. And I'll see you all then. And have a great rest of your Monday afternoon. Bye, everybody.